Hello and welcome to the Green Interview. My guest today is Jeff Rubin, formerly Chief Strategist and Chief Economist at CIBC World Markets, a division of one of Canada's largest banks. Jeff Rubin has always been highly quotable and frequently controversial, and he was one of the first analysts to predict back in 2000 that the price of oil would go to $50 a barrel within 5 years. Oilmen and economists thought he was crazy, and in 2005, when it had gone to $50 a barrel, he predicted that it would triple again double again within 2 years to $100. Within 2 years, it almost tripled. Jeff has sometimes been called a maverick economist, and he's the author of a recent book entitled Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller. As a prophet, he has a pretty good track record. So let's talk about what he's predicting in his book. Jeff, welcome to the Green Interview. It's a real treat to have you here.
My pleasure.
In the book, the basic premise is that oil prices are going to go much, much higher, that there is going to be carbon pricing, carbon taxes that will intensify the impact of those prices, and the total effect of it all will be to reverse globalization and revolutionize our lives. Have we got that about right?
I think that's true. I think the premise of the book is that the whole notion of a global economy where we produce something at one end of the world, ostensibly to take advantage of cheap labor, and sell it at the other end of the world, doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense in a world of triple-digit oil prices, because in so many cases, what we'll save on wages will more than squander on burning bunker fuel.
Yeah, and now, why is it that you're so... the latest forecast I heard that was supposed to have come from you was $225 by 2012.
Well, 200, the extra 25 came in, but okay. Yeah, and you know, but the kind of changes that I'm talking about in the global economy, we already started to see when oil crossed over $100 before this recent recession, and we're about to see again because you know, the red ink on the post-war's deepest recession hasn't even dried, and where are we? We're over $80 a barrel. You know, 3-4 years ago, that would have been a all-time world record high. Now it's where oil trades, where in the first time in 30 years, world oil demand is not growing. So, you know, I think we will very quickly revisit triple-digit oil prices, and at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot we can do about it, but there's a lot we can do about trying to immunize our economy from its effects.
Now, why are the prices going so high?
Well, basically because it's not that we're running out of oil in some absolute geological sense, not even close. There's 165 billion barrels of oil in the Canadian tar sands, maybe as much in the Venezuelan tar sands, and if we suck those sands dry, there's oil in shale. But what the world has run out of is the oil that we can afford to burn, cheap oil, because the prices that will be needed to pull, say for example, 4 million barrels a day out of the Canadian tar sands, which is what the International Energy Agency is forecasting. Those same prices will translate into pump prices that will take millions of North American drivers off the road. You know, for Fort McMurray to become Saudi Arabia, it may be geologically possible, but it's not economically possible, is the point that I'm making, because the kind of prices that we'll need to make that economically viable will mean that it will no longer be practical for us to burn that oil.
But of course, that's not where we've been getting the oil traditionally, right? This is novel. So what's happening to our traditional sources?
Well, it's an excellent point you make, because there's nothing really new about the Canadian tar sands. The Canadian tar sands have been known for decades. What's new is the idea that the Canadian tar sands could ever be a commercially viable source of oil production. And that's what's changed is not the tar sands, what's changed is the rest of the world. What's changed is the depletion of, you know, cheap conventional oil. Conventional oil, i.e. the type of oil you can afford to burn, that hasn't grown since 2005, and that may never grow again. You hear, oil companies and oil producing countries have big gala press announcements about new field discoveries. What you never hear is announcements about depletion. But yet, every year, the world loses 4 million barrels a day of production to depletion out of a total of 85, 86 million barrels. Well, that means that we have to find 20 million barrels of new production over the next 5 years, just so that in 2014, the world will be able to burn as much oil as it does in 2009. And what we're losing is the cheaply produced light Arab sweet crude that costs $3 to $4 a barrel to produce. And what we're replacing it with is synthetic oil from Canadian tar sands that cost $80, $90 a barrel to produce.
And we're also losing from the, you make this point too, that the producers themselves are burning oil at levels we hadn't seen before.
Absolutely.
Tell us about Ski Dubai.
Okay, well, the point here being that no one is thirstier for oil than the very countries that we're relying on to supply us, OPEC. And, people talk about China consuming 7, 8 million barrels. OPEC now consumes more than that. Now, what makes OPEC so thirsty for its own fuel? Well, have you ever filled your tank up in Caracas, Venezuela, or Riyadh, Saudi Arabia? Because if you did, you'd know what I'm talking about. You're talking about 25 cents a gallon gas in Venezuela and maybe 40 to 50 cents a gallon gas in Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the point is that it doesn't matter whether oil prices are $20 a barrel or oil prices are $200 a barrel. It's going to remain 25 cents a gallon in Venezuela and 50 cents a gallon in Saudi Arabia. Now, you mentioned Ski Dubai. Well,
It's a wonderful moment in the book.
Just think of the energy required to go skiing in a place where you can fry an egg on the pavement. One day carbon turns in Ski Dubai consumes as many BTUs, British thermal units of energy, which comes from burning oil and natural gas, as, say, a typical North American would consume driving his or her car for a month. But if you think Ski Dubai is an egregious form of energy consumption, Ski Dubai is nothing. The real issue here is desalination. The Middle East is running out of water much more quickly than they're running out of oil. And what they're doing is converting salt water into fresh water. And through the wonders of desalination, that can occur. But desalination is a hugely energy-intensive process. What do you think powers those desalination plants? For that matter, what powers electricity production in the Middle East in general? They don't have coal. They don't have hydroelectric. We don't want them to have nuclear. So guess what they burn? They burn oil. Now, if 25 cents a gallon seems like a great deal for car drivers, try 7 cents a gallon, because that's what the Saudi utility pays for bunker oil that it burns to produce power that not only powers Ski Dubai, but more importantly, powers all those desalination plants. So what I'm saying is, forget about what these countries are producing. What these countries are exporting is less and less every year because they're increasingly consuming their own production for their own economies.
I should get you just to describe Ski Dubai, because we've talked as though everybody knew what it was, but...
It's an indoor ski hill built in one of the hottest deserts in the world. It has 6 ski runs. It even has a black run, which is an expert run. And again, how do you generate snow in a desert? Well, in the same way you can generate fresh water out of salt water. You burn a whole lot of energy. Now, it's their oil and it's their natural gas. And if they want to build ski hills in the middle of the desert, That's really their thing. And I'm not being judgmental here. I'm just saying these are the very countries that we've been told will supply us with our future oil. I don't think so. Okay? I don't think so.
Yeah, certainly not at the level that we've been led
And
to
they
expect.
haven't in the last 5 years. It's not exports from OPEC that have grown. It's exports from places like Russia and in time places like Alberta tar sands. That is where we're going to be getting our supply from. But that's very expensive and problematic supply. And again, it's not a question of the world running out of oil in some absolute geological sense, because there's oil trapped in all kinds of things. It's about running out of the oil that we can afford to burn, that makes economic sense to utilize.
Tell me about the energy return on investment, because I think that's another one of these concepts that once you begin to grasp it, it changes your understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, whether you're talking about deep water oil, like from 6 miles below the ocean floor, or whether you're talking about tar sands and maybe even in time oil shales, the one common denominator of all unconventional oil is that it requires a tremendous expenditure of energy to get the energy out of the ground. Let me give you an example. Ghawar is still the world's largest oil producing field in Saudi Arabia. It's been in production for over around 50 years. For every 1 British thermal unit of energy invested in that field, you get about 100 back in return. Take the Canadian tar sands. For every 1 British thermal unit of energy expended, you get 3 back in return. Just think of what you have to do to get a barrel of oil out of tar. Not only do you have to pollute 250 gallons of fresh water, but you have to burn 1,400 cubic feet of natural gas to separate the oil from the bitumen. Well, that's a very energy-intensive process. In fact, it's totally contingent on a certain price ratio between natural gas and oil. Now, it just so happens that in today's economy, natural gas in North America is about as cheap as it's ever been compared to oil. It's about 1/3 the cost for a given amount of energy. But it hasn't always been that way. When Katrina hit in the Gulf of Mexico and gas prices rose more than oil, all of a sudden the Canadian oil sands was reverse alchemy. It was turning gold into lead. You were burning natural gas to produce synthetic oil when natural gas was more valuable than oil. Now that's changed, but the general point here is being that as we go to more and more unconventional sources to get our oil, we're burning more and more energy to get at it. And when we go to things like oil shale, it'll even be more energy expended to get that. And at a certain point, that doesn't make any economic sense. And we're not far from reaching that point.
Or any physical sense. I mean, if you wind up to the point where you have to spend 2 units to get 1 back,
right. You're not going to do it.
No, that's right. The fact that you've got the oil becomes completely irrelevant.
Right now, what disguises that diminishing energy rate of return is the fact that in North America, natural gas is the cheapest it's ever been relative to the price of oil. But that can change. That can change. The common denominator is that when you get to unconventional energy, you're spending a lot of energy.
Yeah.
That's basically your bottom line here.
Yeah. Now, your contention about the relationship between the oil price and economic recession is that we've got that backwards.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So
I mean, there's no question that the subprime mortgage crisis blew up my bonus at CIBC World Markets. Why the hell do you think I'm writing a book? But
it's not a good way to make money, Jeff. I've done a lot of them.
But there's a difference between blowing up investment bankers' bonuses and blowing up the world economy. I mean, here's my problem with sort of the Cleveland hypothesis, how depressed property markets like Cleveland, Ohio ended up blowing up the world economy. Why was the recession in Germany and Japan almost twice as severe as the recession in the United States? And why did those economies go into recession even before Cleveland went into recession if this was all about subprime mortgages? I think something bigger was going on. 4 of the last 5 global recessions were caused by oil prices. This was the biggest oil price shock of all. Even in inflation-adjusted terms, this was twice as big as either the OPEC 1 or OPEC 2 shocks. Both of those shocks created deep recessions. Why wouldn't it then stand to reason that the largest oil price shock in history would be the obvious explanation for the deepest post-war recession? And this is not simply of academic interest, because while you can bail out the investment banks, and you can bail out the subprime mortgage holders, and you can bail out an auto industry that's probably on the verge of becoming, extinct by triple-digit oil prices, or certainly obsolete, there can be no energy bailout. The U.S. Treasury, the Federal Reserve Board, the Bank of Canada, none of them can print BTUs of energy. So the problem is that if triple-digit oil prices got us into this recession in the first place, what's going to happen in 6 months from now when we're once again looking at those same prices?
Or worse.
Or worse. And now, of course, now that we've mortgaged our future by running up record deficits, we don't have the fiscal latitude for further bailout campaigns. In fact, the next time we hit triple-digit oil prices, the pendulum will have already shifted, and governments all around the world, including in Canada and the United States, will be trying to bring down their deficits. What are we going to do the next time we have to pay the bill for triple-digit oil prices?
What are we going to do?
Well, what I think we're going to do, because at the end of the day, there's nothing that we can do to prevent oil prices from getting back to those levels and even higher. But what we can do is re-engineer our economies so that the next time we encounter triple-digit oil prices, it doesn't have to have as devastating an impact as it's had in the past. And the way we do that is by going from a global economy, which is an extremely energy and particularly oil-intensive way of doing business, and go back to a local or regional economy.
I want to come back to that, but before we do, another point that you make in the book is that we will almost certainly have some form of carbon taxation or some sort of pricing on emissions that will actually compound the impact of the oil.
I mean, not only will oil cost triple-digit prices to obtain, but we will soon be paying to burn oil. We will soon be paying for our carbon emissions, not just from oil, from all forms of hydrocarbons, but certainly oil is right up there. And we've already seen this in Europe. We're about to see this in North America. And I think we'll be raising the bar for all of our trading partners, that when we start to emit carbon in the atmosphere, we're going to have to put a price on that. And to get back to the Canadian tar sands, I mean, when you burn 1,400 cubic feet of natural gas to produce 1 barrel of oil, there's going to be a carbon price tag associated with that practice.
Which will all of a sudden make it...
Which will just add on to the cost of oil.
Yeah. Now, at this moment, it seems as though there's almost... I sometimes get the sense that we're all running around like blind men, or at least our policymakers and leaders are. But at this point, there seems to be huge resistance to putting any kind of a price on carbon in North America.
That's right.
What's going to change that?
What's going to change that is we're going to realize that by raising the environmental bar, we're going to be bringing jobs home. Where in the past, when we've raised the environmental bar, we've sent jobs away. We've sent jobs away to jurisdictions that play by different rules. So that, as I said in my book, I think what's going to happen is we're going to get Archie Bunker in bed with Al Gore. We're going to see a coalescence of organized labor with the environmental movement, and we're already seeing that in things like the Blue-Green Alliance between the Sierra Club and the U.S. Steelworkers. Because here's the thing, to produce a ton of steel in North America, emits 1/3 less CO2 emissions than it does to produce that ton of steel in China. Now, if carbon emissions are free, who cares? It has no economic impact. What happens if all of a sudden it costs $40, $50, $60 a ton to emit carbon in our atmosphere? All of a sudden, the fact that you can produce steel in North America emitting 1/3 less CO2 than you can in China is going to affect where steel production takes place. The higher the price for carbon emissions, the greater is the economic advantage in emitting less. And that's why I think that when we put a price on carbon emissions and insist that other people, if they want to sell in our market, have to pay the same price, we're going to find that that is bringing jobs home as opposed to sending jobs away. In other words, we're going to turn blue-collar jobs into green-collar jobs.
Why are we not doing that now? It seems, when you say it, it seems so logical.
Because the history of the last 3 decades is that every time we raise the environmental bar, we just shut down factories here and have them relocate in somewhere else in the world. And there's absolutely no point to us taking any steps to reduce our carbon emissions or put a price on those emissions if we're not going to insist that our trading partners play by the same rule. I mean, Kyoto was not a framework for capping global emissions. It was a framework for redistributing global emissions from the countries that signed the agreement to the countries that were outside of the agreement. Now, up until the last 10, 15 years, it was the OECD, the old carbon probates, North America, Western Europe, that were responsible for all the CO2 emissions. That's no longer true. China's already surpassed the United States in emissions and will probably leave it in its dust. We can't prevent China and India from emitting carbon to industrialize. But what we can do is say that if you want to sell your goods in our marketplace, you have to pay the same price for the carbon emissions that went into producing those goods as our producers have to pay through a carbon tariff.
Yeah, so it is a carbon tariff.
That's
something
right.
that they just simply...
Because otherwise, you can't expect our producers to pay for carbon emissions and then pay again by letting their competitors from overseas come into our market and not pay any emissions at all.
And if I understand the premise of what you just said, in the past when we've raised the environmental bar, we've sent the jobs away, but in a sense, there's now no jobs left to send away of that kind. And if we now raise the environmental bar, it doesn't, in a sense, hurt us the way that it might have in the past.
Well, not only does it not hurt us, but I think those jobs are coming back. Mm-hmm. Again, steel's an example that I'm familiar with. Just prior to the global recession, this wasn't emissions, this was simply bunker fuel costs, but it already became uneconomic to import steel from China. I mean, just think of what China has to do to send us steel. First, they have to schlep iron ore from Brazil across the Pacific Ocean, convert it into steel, which is in and of itself a very energy-intensive process, and then ship it back. Well, that added about $90 to the ton, to the cost of a ton of hot-rolled steel. There's only an hour and a half labor time involved in producing steel today. The savings on wage rates between the Chinese steel worker and the North American steel worker was quickly eclipsed by the bunker fuel charges of hauling iron ore halfway across the world and then hauling finished steel back halfway across the world. Now, on top of those transport costs, if you add on the CO2 emissions and put a tariff on that, you won't be seeing too much Chinese steel in North American market anymore. And all of a sudden, those factories that we thought were gone forever are coming back. Who would have dreamt that triple-digit oil prices could breathe new life into our hollowed-out rust belt? But that's exactly what's going to happen.
And we should almost welcome the rising price of oil.
Well, all I'm saying is that there are many silver linings to this story. There are many wrenching adjustments, and I think we're all more or less familiar with those. But perhaps what we're not as familiar with are the silver linings in this story. We're going to see agriculture come back, we're going to see manufacturing come back, and we're also going to see a much greener economy. And ironically, all of these things will be achieved from the very price mechanism that once sent all of those factories away.
What a very strange development.
Well, because distance suddenly costs money. The whole idea of a global economy where you move your factory to the cheapest labor force, wherever that is, irrespective of how far that might be from the market that you serve, is all predicated on the assumption that transport costs are marginal or insignificant. And they are at $20 a barrel. They're not at $150 a barrel.
Yeah, yeah. So what will this? So how would you see a carbon tax coming to Canada, for example?
Well, carbon tariff, yes.
Carbon tariff.
Okay,
well, in a sense, it's a carbon tax too,
it
isn't
is,
it? Because you're
but
saying to your own industry,
right? And before we could put a countervailing tariff on Chinese steel imports, we have to make sure that our own steel producers pay for their carbon emissions. Because until we enforce that domestically, we can't apply that on imports. Now, you know, the knee-jerk reaction from the steel industry or from any carbon-emitting industry is you can't apply these costs on us because it's going to bankrupt us. But if we apply those costs not just on them, but on their competitors, and they actually have an economic advantage in emitting less, I think that changes everything. The U.S. steelworkers or the Canadian steelworkers should be at the forefront of those asking legislators to put a price on carbon emissions, because the higher the price on carbon emissions, the greater the commercial value of being able to emit less.
And you can emit less even just by virtue of your location, because you cut out all that transportation emission,
you cut out all that transportation.
But I think you're also saying that these are cleaner steel mills
That's
anyway.
right. I'm not. Here's where the problem comes down to. 80% of all the power in China comes from burning coal. And coal is by far the cheapest way of generating power if we don't put a price on carbon emissions. So the fact that all these manufacturing plants are from power created by coal, well, they should have to pay for the emissions that occur when coal is being burnt to power those plants. And if we put a price on that, we're going to find that all of a sudden China's dirty energy is not a source of economic strength for them, it's a handicap. It's a source of economic strength for us because we are more carbon efficient. We're more carbon efficient for two reasons. We typically expend less energy to produce a unit of good than they do in economies like China and India. And the energy that we use, coal is maybe 10 to 15% of all the power generated in the Canadian economy. It's about maybe 40 to 50 in the US. It's 80 in China.
So we just have cleaner, basically
we have cleaner power. Now,
power.
why do developing countries go to coal? Because it's by far the cheapest source of power. But it's only the cheapest source of power if we turn a blind eye to the economic costs that it sends up in the atmosphere. It's just like we only pollute 250 gallons of fresh water to make 1 barrel of synthetic oil in Fort McMurray because none of these guys pay for the water. Start making them pay for the water and they'll quickly find a way of using less.
I find part of what I found fascinating about your book is that most economists almost throw up their hands at the whole, the future of kind of the environmental costs of doing business and kind of deny that we can take those into account. But what you do is sort of turn that around and say, no, you've got to do that. Ultimately, if we're going to live on the planet, you've got to put a price on your damage.
And you know, we can't pretend that there's not a cost to these things. It's a market failure, okay? It's a market failure. And the reason that all of those carbon spewing industries are now in places like China is not because China's a more efficient carbon emitter, it's because they're chasing cheap wages. And it doesn't matter what your carbon profile is because carbon has no cost. Only labor has a cost. Okay? Well, all of a sudden, if we put carbon emissions on the same footing as labor, a real economic cost, then all of a sudden economic geography changes, because all of a sudden it doesn't make economic sense that all the carbon spewing industries in the world are in places like China and India. They should be in the places that emit the least. They should be in the most carbon efficient economies. And those aren't the same economies that have the cheap labor markets.
And you make the same point, and not so much in the book, but I mean, we can extend that argument considerably. You just did with the matter of water, right? So if you're paying for the cost of water, that runs up, paying for what it really costs.
You can't expect the CEO of Suncor to be concerned about the 250 gallons of water that his company pollutes to make every barrel of synthetic oil. However, all of a sudden, if it costs $1 a gallon, guess what? The next thing you know, Suncor shareholders would be going, why are earnings down so much this quarter? Well, we got to start paying for the water. Well, why aren't you doing something to use less water? Yeah. And that's exactly what would happen, okay? If we put a price on the water that we use in the Canadian tar sands, I can guarantee you that oil companies would develop technologies to use less water.
Now, let's parse the word "we," because that
if government decided, hey, you want to use 250 gallons of water to make a barrel of synthetic oil, fine, but you're paying X cents or X dollars per gallon now, and let the market do the rest. Because believe me, the market would do the rest if we had that framework. Just like if we put a price on carbon emissions, of all of a sudden, the Obama administration says we're capping CO2 emissions in this economy, and by implication for Canada as well, the market would do the rest. The market would figure out ways of producing things by emitting it less, because all of a sudden, CO2 emissions, just like wages, would filter down to the bottom line. And there's nothing like filtering down to the bottom line to focusing folks' attention.
So what we have is a market failure, in a sense compounded by, or at least held, sustained for the moment by, a political failure.
That's right. That's right. And but it comes from an economic misperception. The bias out there is we can't afford to raise the environmental bar without jeopardizing our economy. And I'm saying not only would we not jeopardize our economy, we would strengthen our economy, provided that when we raise the bar for our own producers, we apply the same standards on everybody else who wants to import goods to our market. Now, if we don't do that, then it becomes quixotic to impose that on our own producers, because all we're going to do is blow up our own economy and do nothing for global emissions, because all the emitters will simply move to the jurisdiction where it's not controlled. And as far as the biosphere is concerned, the biosphere doesn't care whether the emissions come from China or the emissions come from Nova Scotia. You know, there's no borders up there. So I'm saying, yes, we need the carbon tariff is absolutely essential if we're going to make our own producers pay for their emissions. Yeah. But in a world where there is a carbon tariff, when the United Steelworkers go through the math, they're going to realize that the higher the price of emissions in North America, the more steel jobs there'll be in North America, and the less imports of steel we'll be getting from dirty power countries like China.
The next step, I guess, is to persuade the politicians to actually do that, and which means, in a sense, of getting more real, and getting. But this I guess what I'm thinking is this is quite a sophisticated argument that you're putting here. I think it's a correct one, but I think it's quite a sophisticated one, and getting that to the point where it permeates the thinking of people like the steelworkers, the Archie.
We got a bit of work ahead of us, yeah. But you know what? If you get Archie Bunker in bed with Al Gore, that's a pretty powerful political combo in any country, right? Yeah. I mean, save the world and bring back long-lost manufacturing jobs seems to me to be a win-win combo.
Yeah. Now, something we haven't talked about, and that you don't take very seriously, is alternatives to oil. alternative sources
It's
of
not
energy?
that I don't take seriously.
Well, in terms of the scale.
It's a question of timing, okay? There's no question that triple-digit oil prices will incent the development of alternative energy technologies. I mean, I think economic history speaks quite clearly on that. Technological change just doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs in an economic context. However, our rendezvous with triple-digit oil prices isn't in 10 or 15 years. It's in 6 months. So, technology is what technology is in the here and now. In the here and now, it's not about converting, camel dung into rocket fuel. It's about finding a way of using less oil, okay? Yeah. It isn't on the supply side, it's on the demand side. Sure, 15 years from now, we may be harnessing, a power from tides in the Bay of Fundy, okay? But right now, okay, we're burning coal. And right now, we're burning oil in our cars. We have to figure out a way of immunizing the economy from triple-digit oil prices now, not in 10 to 15 years when we develop post-carbon technologies. And the easiest and most effective way of immunizing our economy from triple-digit oil prices, the single biggest factor in reducing the oil intensity of a unit of GDP, is to not move things all around the world all the time. Because no matter how you move these things, by air, by boat, by train, by car or truck, you're burning oil. So that's why I'm saying the onus has got to be on the demand side. Sure, maybe we'll develop 50 million electric cars, although if we tried to plug in 50 million electric cars right now, the lights would go out because we don't have the spare generating capacity. But in the here and now, what about getting off the road? The only problem is that instead of spending billions of dollars in investing in public transit, so that when people do get off the road, there's a bus to get on, we'd rather spend billions of dollars to prop up General Motors. To me, that's the wrong choice.
Yeah, and to build, to continue to build
to
roads
build highways when
yeah.
These highways are ultimately going to be subject to some form of abandonment.
Yeah, they may ultimately become fields again.
Yeah, so those are the wrong choices we're making. And not only are we making the wrong choices, but we're strapping on some huge deficits, mortgaging our future. If we're going to mortgage our future fiscally, like particularly our neighbors to the south are, let's at least invest in the future, not in the past. An investment in GM is, in my opinion, an investment in the past. An investment in public transit is, in my opinion, an investment in the future.
You don't take ethanol very seriously as a substitute.
No, we get back to the energy rate of return that you mentioned earlier. I said how poor it was for the Canadian tar sands, but the Canadian tar sands are like gawar compared to the return on ethanol. I mean, ethanol may look very green, but 75% of the energy that's in that beaker there of distilled corn-based ethanol is really disguised hydrocarbon. I mean, what runs the tractors? 40% of fertilizer in the U.S. goes for corn production. How do you think they generate fertilizer? How does the corn get to the ethanol processing plant? Doesn't walk by itself. What powers the ethanol processing plant? How does the final product get to the gas station? Ethanol can't be shipped by pipeline. It has to be trucked. What do you think those trucks are running on? Not ethanol, diesel. So again, this has become a giant head fake that we're doing virtually nothing to resolve the energy issue, but what we are doing is diverting the corn from food supply to energy. And what the resulting impact on food inflation is very clear. So again, the answer is not on the supply side. It's not, as I say, finding a way of making camel dung into rocket fuel. The answer is find ways of organizing economy that requires less oil to be burned. And that can be done, and I'm actually quite hopeful that that will be done because I'm an economist and I believe in the power of prices. We're going to abandon our cars, not because of any commitment we're making to ecological sustainability. We're going to abandon our cars simply for the same reason that we're going to abandon those houses 50 miles from where we work. We won't be able to afford that lifestyle anymore.
Yep. You also say that expensive oil means expensive money.
Yes, cheap oil meant cheap money. So here we get to the heart of
Link
what
that.
caused this recession, okay? What caused this recession is, on the face of it, a huge housing market crash, that all of a sudden people couldn't pay their subprime mortgages, and these subprime mortgages were in turn made into fancy derivative instruments on Wall Street. So when people couldn't pay their subprime mortgages, they defaulted on these fancy financial instruments, which banks held, and then led to insolvency in the banking system. And that's fine as far as it goes, but you got to ask yourself the question, why are interest rates so low originally? And why did interest rates move up so quickly? And that had nothing to do with subprime mortgages. It had everything to do with the price of oil. 2004, oil was about $30, inflation was around 1%, and interest rates were around 1% in the United States. Oil went from around $34 in January 2004 to about $70 in January 2006. The energy component of US CPI inflation went from 1% to 35%. The all items inflation number went from 1% to 5.5%. The Fed funds rate went from 1% to 5.5%. And all of a sudden, there wasn't cheap money anymore. All of a sudden, you had a mountain of subprime mortgages that now had to be refinanced at rates that were 2 to 3 times what they were when they were first conceived. But if oil would have stayed at $35 a barrel like it was in 2004, so would have inflation. And if inflation would have stayed at 1%, so would interest rates. And if interest rates would have stayed at 1%, we would have never had the huge defaults in subprime mortgages. Subprime mortgages wasn't the cause. It was a symptom of something a lot bigger. And that something bigger was triple-digit oil prices.
You seem to be the only guy saying this.
I am indeed.
How does that feel?
It feels good. But look at the facts. The facts speak for themselves. I mean, I was a chief economist of an investment bank for the better part of 2 decades. I spent a lot of time looking at those facts.
Yeah, for sure. So now, if high oil prices mean expensive money, doesn't this give us another whole ripple into the
Oh, it certainly does, and
what does that do to us?
Well, the reason that the reason that governments have bailed out Wall Street, Bay Street, mortgage holders is that we all feared the boogeyman out there was Japanese deflation. The fear was that these toxic mortgages were going to reek in bank vaults for decades, and that banks wouldn't lend any money, and we'd be in a credit crunch like Japan was from 1990 to 2000. That's not where we're going. We're going in a very different world. We're going in a very inflationary world for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, just as when oil prices went from $37 to $74, all of a sudden inflation went from 1 to 5.5%. That's going to happen in the next 12 to 24 months as oil prices once again recover. Secondly, everything that we end up making here locally, whether it's flat screen TVs or steel or furniture or food, is going to cost us more than getting it from some cheap labor source halfway around the world. And thirdly, with these huge deficits, particularly in the United States, they're going to end up just printing a whole lot of money, which is the way they've always done when they were saddled with these huge deficits. So I think the world we're heading into is a highly inflationary world, but what has motivated all of these policies is the fear that we were going into Japanese-style deflation. I think that's a head fake, just like I think thinking the subprime mortgage market was the cause of this recession is a head fake and a costly head fake.
So has this been like The classic case of the generals fighting the last war?
Something of that nature. You know, to find a cure for a disease, you first have to know the nature of it. To chart a policy for a sustainable recovery from a recession, you first have to understand the true cause of that recession. This recession was not caused by imploding Cleveland property prices. This recession was caused by $147 oil. And the remedies that we have taken are not only ineffective to deal with triple-digit oil prices, but will tie our hands behind our back the next time we have to encounter that, because now we have to have these massive deficits.
So now as a householder and a retired man, I guess, no longer employed with the bank anyway, what do you do? How do you take all this stuff and translate it into the way you deal with your own personal life and your own personal finances? What sorts of things would a smart person be doing right now?
Well, you know, I think that what we're going to find is that we're going to become much more in touch with our local neighborhoods. We're going to come much more in touch with our local economies. And we're going to find ways of burning a whole lot less oil. And what will guide us will be prices. As much as I would like everyone in the world to go out and buy my book, it won't be necessary to buy my book to know what to do when gas costs $2 a liter. You'll figure that out all by yourself. And that's why I think that, you know, triple-digit oil prices is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a clarion call, okay? It will guide us. And it will guide us in directions that we need to take, that we probably would not take have we not encountered these prices. So, you know, when you ask what should people do, you know, I think people just have to listen to the price mechanism. The price mechanism will say it doesn't make any sense for you to live 60 kilometers away from where you work and to commute on some, you know, expressway driving an SUV. You'll figure that out all by yourself. The price mechanism will say it doesn't make any sense to fly in tangerines from Chile to Halifax in the middle of the winter. So you'll eat apples from the Annapolis Valley. You'll figure that out all by yourself. In other words, you know, the price mechanism is basically our saving grace. Mm-hmm. The very same economic forces that led to globalization will ultimately lead to deglobalization.
Except that those forces weren't all counted, right? That there's an accounting change in effect that's going on here too. Because we're now not taking as being free things that should not be taken as free.
You mean on the carbon emissions?
Yeah.
Right.
And on much else, but
right.
You know.
Right, but I would argue that, you know, we were kidding ourselves. There was a cost to that. Okay?
Sure,
climate change is real, and it has huge economic costs. And for us to pretend that there were no costs doesn't mean that those costs didn't exist. It just meant we got head faked. And again, it led to a dislocation of economic geography because we thought certain places had a real economic comparative advantage when maybe they don't. They only have an economic advantage if we tend to ignore these costs. But I don't think we can ignore these costs anymore, and I don't think we will.
Yeah, and that's the huge change, isn't it? That it isn't the nature of price mechanisms that's changed. It's the nature of what gets priced.
Yeah, it's not the price mechanisms that's at fault. We have to understand that by not putting a price on carbon emissions, that was a market failure. Okay, because carbon emissions are a real economic cost, just like polluting fresh water is in the Canadian tar sands.
Mm-hmm. Further to this whole business of we'll figure it out, and that there are, because I think most people look at the possibility of a $200 oil and immediately think everything in my life is going to change, which is true.
Which is true. But not necessarily.
And it's going to be bad, which is not, yeah, that's right, which is not necessarily true. You had some fascinating stuff about, you commented that energy efficiency leads to increased consumption, but you also had a whole bunch of things about about stuff that's been done in the past. Electric cars in 1898.
That's right. Well, I mean, what people didn't realize was that up until Cadillac's discovery of the electric starter, which was around 1915, there were more electric vehicles on the road than there were internal combustion engines. In fact, in those days, you had to be basically a weightlifter to start your car with the manual crank. You know, that was a huge event when they developed an electric starter. And then, of course, the electric car became obsolete. You know, forklift trucks and electric trolleys are all that remained. But initially, cars were electric. Now, the problem, as I mentioned earlier in this interview, with going to the electric car, because on the face of it, it sounds like, well, it solves the $200 oil problem and it solves the carbon emission problem, except that batteries are not a form of energy. They store energy, okay? So, you know, if I remember in 2003, I had to walk down about 18 flights of stairs in First Canadian Place because the whole grid went out between New York, Detroit, and Toronto because one air conditioner too many was plugged in on a hot day in July. Try plugging in 50 million volts and then see what happens. Volt being the GM electric car. Yeah. So the electric car, yes, on the face of it sounds like the solution. However, it's not the solution if we have to build 800 new coal plants to develop the power capacity to charge those batteries. That's all I'm saying. But the interesting part about the auto industry is that up until Cadillac's discovery of the electric starter, there were more electric cars than there were internal combustion engine cars. Another interesting thing about the auto industry is that during World War II, Detroit turned itself into a munitions place. It wasn't producing cars, it was producing tanks and bombers. And I'm just saying that if Detroit could, during World War II, convert itself into a manufacturer of tanks and bombers, why couldn't it now convert itself into a producer of public transit vehicles?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what we should have been spending billions of dollars on, if we're going to go that route.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the things that appeals to me about the electric car is that it solves half of a problem. It does solve the problem of an emissions directly from the vehicle.
Depending on where, but not if you've got coal plants that are used to create the power.
Then it just pushes it off one step. But if you're able to get electric power from something else, tidal power, even nuclear, but whatever,
yes,
then it really does become it's a piece of the solution. It isn't a solution in itself.
Right, and it may well become more and more of the solution, but here's the thing, that, I mean, I don't know how many volts GM's going to produce in 2010, that they said originally 50,000, probably less, but even if they do, there's 247 million vehicles on the road in North America, okay? So even if we produce 50,000 volts, I mean, you know, it's going to take a long time, whereas, you know, all of a sudden, $7 a gallon gasoline, that immediately, you know, gets to the hub of the problem.
That makes big changes.
You know, I think that in the next 10 years, if I'm right about oil prices, we roughly have in the States about 250 million vehicles on the road. If we use sort of Western European rates of car ownership as a guide, because I'm forecasting that we'll be paying those kind of gasoline prices, we can probably expect 1 out of every 5 cars to get off the road, hence losing about 50 million vehicle registrations in the United States. Hence my question, why is the taxpayer owning General Motors? You know, if that's the sales outlook, why are we owning General Motors?
Why would we have invested in that?
Right, you know. It's the same thing as when they bailed out all these banks, okay? I mean, why does the taxpayer own Merrill Lynch when the market crashes? How about owning Merrill Lynch when the market's soaring?
Yes,
you know?
yes. How about owning Goldman Sachs now instead of a year ago?
Exactly,
right?
exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I just think that was, I mean, we've done a lot of things here that I think in retrospect will be really silly. And I think the reason we did these silly things was our failure to understand what was the true cause of this recession. Because had we understood that this was really an energy shock, and this is the economy's response to $147 oil, I think we would have done things quite differently, vis-a-vis the bailout of Wall Street and the bailout of Detroit.
I'm sure you're right. I'm sure that it'll be.
But as an economist, I'm hopeful because as an economist, I believe in the power of prices. And when we see in 6 months from now oil prices back at $100 a barrel, we'll realize that this isn't some fluke caused by speculators trading. This is a fundamental mismatch between global oil demand and global oil supply, and we got to get our head around re-engineering the economy for triple-digit oil prices. Once we understand that, I think we'll come up with some intelligent policies.
It's really interesting to notice that every time the oil price goes up, and it's gone up and goes up and falls back, goes up and falls back. Well, it never falls back to where it started
That's
up
right.
from.
That's right. I mean, here we
now
are.
think $70 oil is pretty reasonable.
I mean, you know, all of a sudden, oil today is trading a little bit above $80, and this is the deepest post-war recession on record, not just in Canada and the United States, but throughout the whole world. This is the first year since 1983 that world oil demand actually fell. 1983 was after the second OPEC oil shock. And where's oil trading? At $80 a barrel. So, I mean, if oil's trading at $80 a barrel in these circumstances, where do we reasonably expect oil to be trading once the economy does get back on its feet? I'd say we're months away from triple-digit oil prices. And then the question is, well, hey, you know, is this economy going to be able to operate with those prices any better than it has in the past? Because in the past, it hasn't been able to operate with these prices. You know, we're not going to see vehicle sale units in the United States of 16, 17 million anymore. That's an era of cheap energy. You know, this is not just a cyclical, short-term downsizing for the industry, but for industries like auto and air traffic, for example. This is a secular change. This is a long-run change. So let's not, as I say, spend billions of dollars of taxpayers' money trying to prop up industries that are doomed to obsolescence by triple-digit oil prices.
You really are a hopeful person.
I'm an economist. I believe in the power of prices.
That's not the same thing, right? No, but you really are. I mean, when you talk about this,
well, because I see a lot of, you know, I didn't think that our old carbon-dominated world was necessarily such a great world to begin with, okay? I mean, yes, it gave us conveniences. Yeah, globalization gave us, you know, an infinite array of cheaply produced consumer goods. And yes, we're going to have to pay more for our flat screen TVs if they're made in Kitchener than if they're made in Korea, okay? There's no question about that. But all I'm saying is there are a lot of positives here too, and that's what I think gets lost. That triple-digit oil prices doesn't have to be apocalyptic. It's only apocalyptic if we insist on living and having the economy organized the same way as when oil was cheap and abundant. But then I get back to I'm an economist, I believe in the power of prices. People will change. People will change for no other reason than they simply will not be able to afford their old lifestyles.
I really appreciate this, and I really appreciate that because I guess underneath all of that, there's a relatively sunny assumption that all of this will in fact work its way out for very good, solid, rational reasons, such as you've described. And I think that's a very promising, that's a very useful and lovely thing.
I thought, you know, that was maybe where my book might be different from other people who have certainly pointed out the dangers of oil depletion and triple-digit oil prices is it doesn't have to be apocalyptic. There are more than a few silver linings to this story.
Thank you very much for coming here and bringing us some sense of those silver linings. I really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure.
Okay.